On Tuesday, December 2nd, Netflix released a documentary that didn't feel like entertainment at all. Sean Combs, The Reckoning arrived quietly, without flashy promotion, but within hours it was everywhere. 4 parts, one name, and a feeling that something irreversible had just been set in motion. Viewers didn't watch this series casually. They leaned forward. From the opening minutes, it was clear. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't a tribute. This was exposure. The pacing was slow, intentional, like every frame had been placed with surgical precision. Old footage appeared first, clips people had forgotten existed, harmless moments captured years ago. But in this new context, those scenes felt heavier. Longer pauses, blank stares, expressions that once seemed casual, now carried meaning viewers couldn't ignore. And behind the entire project, silently but powerfully, was 50 Cent. Not ranting on camera, not arguing for attention. His presence was in the structure, the order of revelations, the careful sequencing, the restraint. This wasn't chaos, this was strategy. As each episode unfolded, previously unseen videos began surfacing. Not dramatizations, not speculation, footage, dated, archived, and controlled until now. The kind of material that doesn't need explanation because the implications sit uncomfortably on their own. Then came the calls. Real voices, soft-spoken, almost casual. The documentary didn't rush to explain them. It let the recordings sit there, unchallenged, the silence afterward lingering long enough for viewers to process what they had heard. Confidence like that only exists when someone believes consequences are distant or impossible. Online reactions exploded instantly. Screenshots, slowed audio analysis, timeline breakdowns. Analysts were pausing scenes frame by frame, comparing dates on footage with legal filings. Journalists reopened archive folders. The narrative shifted within hours. Not what does this mean, but how long has this been ignored? Before going deeper into this video, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That's how you'll never miss any breaking updates like this. Now let's get back to the story, because what happened next wasn't just reaction. It was escalation. Pressure began mounting behind closed doors. Victim advocacy groups amplified demands. Legal insiders whispered that federal prosecutors were closely monitoring the public's response. And as momentum built outside the courthouse, attention turned inward. That's when the whispers shifted into something far more serious. Rumors spread late Thursday night that an emergency discussion had been quietly scheduled. Court staff noticed unusual schedule changes. Some claimed they saw familiar legal teams arriving early, avoiding press entrances. And by Friday morning, word spread that Judge Arun Subramanian had initiated a closed-door legal review. An extraordinary move if true. Cameras barred, media blocked, silence enforced. Those present remained silent afterward, and the silence itself became unsettling. Legal analysts began raising a question that once seemed unthinkable. Could documentary footage, combined with public pressure, lead the court to evaluate harsher sentencing? Could the original 50-month sentence be reconsidered? Could life be placed on the table? Nothing official has been confirmed. But tension continues to build as whispers from courtroom staff, unnamed attorneys, and industry insiders suggest the conversation is happening behind sealed wooden doors. And if there is even a possibility that the sentencing phase has reopened, it means one thing. This story is no longer over. It's entering a stage it was never expected to reach, a phase where media exposure collides with judicial responsibility, and the outcome could alter Sean Combs' future forever. Whispers spread through courthouse hallways long before anyone outside caught the scent of movement. A secretary closing a file too quickly, a security guard adjusting protocols he couldn't explain, attorneys walking with their heads low, conversations clipped short as if microphones hid inside every echo. People sensed something changing, not publicly, not loudly, but quietly, and that made it heavier. Inside legal circles, eyes shifted toward one thing, the documentary, a film that shouldn't have mattered to a judge, now pushing pressure into places entertainment rarely reaches. The Reckoning wasn't just playing on screens. It was replaying in minds. The footage, the calls, the still frames, each detail carried the weight of potential reconsideration. Some said prosecutors had begun reviewing internal notes, comparing public claims to sealed materials. Others whispered of digital forensics teams combing through devices already in evidence, searching for alignment between what Netflix revealed and what law enforcement previously overlooked. Nothing official, nothing confirmed. But the lack of denial spoke volumes. Meanwhile, outside the court system, the world was reacting with urgency. Calls for accountability surged. Advocacy groups demanded clarification. Some argued the documentary exposed gaps too significant to ignore. Others insisted sentencing must remain untouched, warning against letting public opinion rewrite legal boundaries. But deep beneath public debate, the pressure shifted somewhere else, on Diddy's legal defense. For the first time since sentencing, legal strategists were forced to consider contingencies. What if the sentence could be reevaluated? What if the judge reopened the door? What if additional proceedings formed around footage the public now analyzed frame by frame? Behind polished stone walls and locked chambers, documents were shuffled, reviewed, reconsidered. The mood had changed. The pause between decisions now carried weight, like each silence hid a choice waiting to be made. And then came the moment that sent shock through those paying attention. A confidential clerk allegedly requested sealed access to archived sentencing documents, a request so specific it sparked speculation. Why revisit files already closed? Why now? And why quietly? The emotional impact rippled outward. For those still wrestling with past trauma connected to the case, the documentary reopened wounds long buried, social feeds filled with conflicting emotions, relief, anger, fear, hope. Threads debated whether justice was complete or only beginning. Every hour added momentum. News commentary grew sharper, cautiously posing difficult questions. Analysts mapped possible outcomes if sentencing reconsideration occurred. Legal scaffolding, connecting public pressure to court review. Cameras outside the courthouse captured nothing but closed doors. Yet that emptiness fueled the story. Something was happening where no one could see it. Inside conversations between attorneys, nervous glances traded between defense counsel. Because once a case enters this stage, outcomes become unpredictable. Judges hold discretion, prosecutors hold leverage, and defendants hold fear. If a judge publicly acknowledges a review, the story evolves from rumor into reality. And if sentencing reopens, past decisions face reevaluation through a new lens, one informed by what millions witnessed in the reckoning. For now, there is no announcement, no statement, no leak big enough to confirm. But every indication points toward a system bracing for impact. What began as a documentary release now presses against the courtroom walls, waiting to see whether judgment ends where it started, or whether consequences could extend into territory no one imagined it when the first gavel struck. By the following week, the atmosphere surrounding the courthouse felt different. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just tense in a way that silence makes louder. Reporters who once camped for statements now stood farther back, unsure if anything official would ever surface. Court staff avoided eye contact, hurrying through security without a word. Something had shifted in the air, like the building itself was holding its breath. Inside legal offices across the city, phones buzzed with encrypted messages. Attorneys debated strategies late into the night, reviewing sentencing precedents and rarely invoked judicial powers. Some argued that reviewing a sentence under pressure set a dangerous precedent. Others whispered that ignoring new public revelations risked greater damage to the system's credibility. And hovering between both sides was the same fear. The court wasn't done. Meanwhile, speculation migrated from the courtroom to the man at the center of it all. Those close to Diddy allegedly reported sleepless nights, brief but escalating conversations with counsel, and a growing awareness that the story had regained momentum. His world, once a fortress built on influence, wealth, and loyalty, now felt porous, with tiny cracks spreading faster than anyone could contain. But the real shift didn't happen publicly. It happened during a quiet exchange between two senior prosecutors reviewing archived material. A single phrase whispered through legal circles: alignment. Not proof, not certainty, but alignment between patterns long suspected and footage now circulating globally. Alignment is dangerous in criminal law because it suggests possibility. Possibility invites examination. Examination can lead to action. Defense attorneys waited in unease for any sign, any email, any summons, any order that confirmed the direction the judge was leaning. But silence persisted, and silence from a court reviewing a sentence is rarely neutrality, it's deliberation. Days passed and speculation hardened into expectation. Advocacy groups called emergency press conferences demanding judicial transparency. Social media commenters insisted life sentences must be considered. Influencers dissected expressions captured in courtroom sketches, guessing at meaning. Pressure grew not from outrage alone, but from a collective sense that the legal system could not ignore the weight of what millions had witnessed. Through all of this, 50 Cent never raised his voice. He didn't have to. The documentary had spoken. And fans began wondering whether he had anticipated this shift all along, whether the timing, the pacing, the controlled release of footage was more than storytelling. Some viewed it as strategic accountability. Others called it manipulation. But all agreed the series had altered the landscape in ways impossible to reverse. For Diddy, time seemed to slow. Each passing day stretched longer than the last, filled not with answers, but possibilities, each more threatening than the one before. Legal experts explained that a sentencing modification would require justification. Advocates argued the documentary provided moral grounds. And in the shadows of this debate, the judge held the authority to determine whether moral weight could influence legal review. The public couldn't see inside the courthouse, but the tension felt visible, like electricity you sense before a storm breaks, like footsteps approaching behind a locked door. Then came the rumor that spread faster than any official announcement it ever could. A new motion had been drafted, not filed, not stamped, not entered into public record, but prepared, waiting, because courts do not move on speculation, but they prepare for possibility. And if that motion finds daylight, if it enters the chamber where decisions become history, then the question will no longer be whether Diddy's case can be revisited, but whether the court is willing to carry the weight of a decision that echoes beyond one man, one documentary, one sentence. The world waits, not for news, but for consequence. Days later, something subtle, almost imperceptible, began to unfold in the shadows of the courthouse. Files that had remained untouched since sentencing were quietly requested from storage. Log entries reflected access approvals without explanation. Clerks exchanged looks that suggested they understood more than they could say. The building seemed to shift from routine operation to something more cautious, deliberate, and alert. Inside defense offices, unease grew. Attorneys whispered about precedent, about judicial discretion, about how public exposure complicates legal boundaries. Even the most confident voices began choosing their words carefully, knowing that every interpretation could ripple outward. Some asked whether justice was being influenced by narrative. Others asked whether the narrative had revealed what justice missed. Meanwhile, prosecutors didn't rush. They didn't celebrate. They simply prepared. Because if the court opened the door, even slightly, they would need to walk through with precision. Drafts were edited, arguments rehearsed, evidence lists reorganized. The weight of possibility demanded readiness. For Diddy, silence pressed harder than any verdict. Conversations with counsel reportedly shortened, tension rising between pauses. Nights grew longer, days heavier. The thought that sentencing might not be settled became more than fear. It became anticipation of impact. A future once measured in months began to stretch toward unthinkable territory. Outside the courthouse, the public remained restless. Protesters gathered not to shout, but to stand. Signs held still in the cold air demanded transparency, accountability, review. Media cameras filmed crowds, searching for any shift in mood. Reporters analyzed expressions, gestures, fragments of overheard conversations. Every rumor fed the sense that a reckoning was moving closer. In living rooms and cafes across the country, viewers replayed clips from the reckoning, not casually, but meticulously, Slowing frames, isolating audio, connecting dots only suggested, never confirmed. Discussion threads filled with arguments from amateur analysts and retired legal professionals alike. People weren't just reacting. They were participating in a public examination of power and consequence. Even those who questioned the documentary's motives couldn't deny its impact. It sparked something systemic, like a stone dropped into water, ripples spreading across layers of legal, cultural, and moral reflection. A question surfaced across the nation. How should a system respond when public exposure reveals shadow sentencing left untouched? Then came an unverified report circulating among courthouse staff, a sealed envelope delivered directly to the judge's chambers late in the evening. No filing record, no timestamp visible to the public. Theories grew instantly. Was it a motion, a request, a recommendation, or something else entirely? No one knew, but the mere existence of that envelope, real or imagined, intensified the atmosphere. Inside chambers shielded by silence, the judge faced a decision no one envied. To reconsider sentencing risked accusation of yielding to external pressure. To ignore new revelations risked appearing indifferent to evolving context. The balance between law and legitimacy strained under the weight of millions of watchful eyes. And through every step, one undeniable fact lingered. Whether the courtroom acknowledged it or not, the documentary had reshaped the world in which the original sentence existed. It shifted public understanding, legal expectations, and cultural tolerance for silence. Now eyes waited, not for spectacle, but resolution. Every passing hour felt like the pause before history reveals its next line. Because if the court decides the sentence must reflect more than what was known at the time, the consequences could extend far beyond the man standing before the bench. In the quiet corridors of justice, decisions begin in silence long before they're spoken aloud. And somewhere behind that heavy wooden door, a judge weighed not only law but legacy. Whispers of the sealed envelope spread like a spark catching dry brush. Legal interns whispered in stairwells. Courthouse janitors paused near doorways, pretending to sweep while listening for passing clues. Something was shifting inside a system built on precision and procedure. And though no official word emerged, a current of anticipation pulsed through the marble hallways. Prosecutors quietly expanded late-night meetings, screens lit with case files reflecting in tired eyes. Sleeves rolled, voices lowered. Every argument needed to be airtight, not for trial, but for the possibility of a sentencing review no one had publicly acknowledged. They organized timelines, transcripts, exhibits, and theoretical counterarguments. The goal was simple: readiness. Defense lawyers felt the walls close in. Some privately admitted they feared the momentum behind the documentary had reached a point beyond control. They reviewed appeals options, drafted statements, debated whether to request recusal or venue change should sentencing reopen. The tone in their offices shifted, less confident, more urgent. And through it all, Diddy remained shielded from public view. But silence from a man once louder than his empire spoke louder than any statement. A career built on visibility now existed in shadows, waiting. Outside, conversations across the nation evolved. This was no longer about celebrity scandal. People invoked larger questions. When institutions face public pressure, what principles guide them? Should sentencing remain untouched if new information ignites doubt? Can public awareness reshape judicial action? In private chambers, the judge worked late. Stacks of sentencing notes lined the desk. Case law references littered the workspace. And somewhere in the mess lay the weight of a decision no one expected to revisit. The measured scrape of pages turning broke the silence, like each document demanded consideration in a context far different from the one present when sentencing was declared final. Rumors surfaced that court officials scheduled additional security briefings, not because of protests or threats, but because something was anticipated, something requiring order, privacy, and control. Legal analysts speculated cautiously. Some warned that reopening sentencing risked undermining the foundation of judicial consistency. Others argued that evolving context, if significant, requires evolving response. Both sides carried conviction, and both understood the stakes were bigger than one case. Meanwhile, the envelope remained central to every whispered theory. Some imagined it contained evidence. Others believed it held a motion requesting sentencing review. A few suggested it carried a judicial inquiry about the interplay between public exposure and sentencing integrity. The truth remained sealed. Then late one night, a clerk leaving the judge's chambers reportedly looked shaken, walking quickly, eyes fixed forward. They ignored greetings and disappeared into the parking structure without explanation. It was the kind of moment observers replayed in their minds, tiny, fleeting, yet weighted with implication. Inside those chambers, a difficult question pressed against the judge's conscience. When justice intersects with new public knowledge, even if indirect, can a sentence truly remain untouched? And if the answer is no, who bears responsibility? The courthouse, once a monument to predictable order, now felt like a stage preparing for revelation. Every creak of the floorboards, every closing door carried a shadow of expectation. Somewhere inside, pen hovered over paper. Options were weighed, legacy balanced against precedent. Silence stretched into a decision's shape, but not yet its words. The world outside still slept unaware, but in that narrow window of time between dusk and dawn, the future began to rearrange itself quietly. A decision was forming, one that could redraw the lines of consequence and redefine what sentencing means when exposure collides with justice. The judge didn't speak of the matter publicly, not even in passing, but inside those locked chambers, a decision began to take shape, slowly, reluctantly, as though the weight of history pressed down on every possible outcome. The pen finally touched paper. Notes were written, not orders, not rulings, just questions. Questions that signaled doubt about whether the original sentence reflected the gravity of what had since been revealed in the documentary. Notes questioning whether public trust could survive silence. Notes acknowledging that justice, once settled, sometimes demands a second look when new context erupts into daylight. Meanwhile, the courthouse prepared quietly for something it did not name. Courtroom benches were inspected, doors tested, security rerouted, staff briefed with neutral language that hid urgency beneath formal instruction. At the same time, prosecutors reviewed unfamiliar territory, how to present arguments for a sentencing reconsideration when the catalyst was a documentary seen by millions rather than sealed evidence. They dissected every scene lawyers might reference, knowing that public impact could not be cited, but context could. Defense attorneys convened emergency meetings. They contemplated whether to request sealed proceedings, fearing media frenzy and speculating that public pressure could influence judicial interpretation. The weight of possibility tightened around them, pressing into every strategy session, every phone call, every late-night email left intentionally vague. In the midst of this tension, Diddy grew quiet, not silent, but withdrawn. Conversations shortened. Counsel sensed the burden settling into his posture. For years, power insulated him from vulnerability. Now the insulation frayed. Influence no longer guaranteed stability. Outside, social tensions escalated, not violent, not chaotic, but charged by anticipation. People gathered outside the courthouse not to shout demands, but to witness history, whether it took form or dissolved into rumor. Reporters stood ready with cameras aimed at doors that hadn't opened yet. The absence of movement became news in itself. Inside the courthouse, time moved differently. Seconds stretched, decisions pressed forward, then retreated for reconsideration. Law is slow, steady, deliberate. But here, something invisible accelerated the pace. An urgency built on public scrutiny and the unsettling power of hidden footage brought into the world. A late-night light glowed from the judge's chambers long after staff had gone home. Pages turned slowly, as if waiting for their fate. Behind that door, the judge faced a silent truth. If sentencing remained unchanged, questions would linger. Questions about whether justice resisted accountability. But if sentencing changed, another danger emerged. The risk of appearing to yield to public outrage rather than legal necessity. The decision wasn't simple. It wasn't procedural. It was personal, in a way the law rarely admits openly. The judge understood that any move now could reverberate beyond the courthouse, reshaping expectations for future cases influenced by public exposure. As the night deepened, the pen moved again, this time with conviction. Notes shifted into structure. Questions narrowed into considerations. And considerations leaned towards something heavier than review: reconsideration. In that moment, the decision crossed a line. The judge's thoughts were no longer about whether to act, but how to act. The original sentence no longer stood untouched in the judge's mind. It was being weighed, measured, held against a shifting landscape shaped by silence breaking open through the screen. A final line was underlined, its meaning not yet spoken but undeniable. Possibility had become intention. Collecting evidence was finished. Deliberation had begun to solidify. The courthouse slept unaware. The public waited without knowing what they were waiting for. But somewhere inside those walls, the future had already shifted. The decision wasn't announced. Not yet. But it existed, written, considered, and ready to move into the world when the judge chose to speak. The morning the decision was made to bring the parties back to court, there was no announcement, no press advisory, no alert sent to reporters' inboxes. Instead, a quiet chain of internal communications rippled through courthouse staff. A select list of attorneys received sealed notices. Security was expanded without explanation. Doors normally unlocked at dawn remained closed until every checkpoint had been reinforced. Word leaked anyway, but only in fragments. Anonymously written messages passed through encrypted chats. Someone claimed the judge had finalized preliminary considerations. Someone else insisted a sentencing modification hearing was imminent. No one could verify anything. And that uncertainty ignited a different kind of fear. Not fear of what was happening, but fear of what could. Defense counsel arrived first, in black SUVs with tinted windows, slipping through a private entrance. Minutes later, prosecutors followed, escorted by marshals down a side hallway almost no one uses unless circumstances demand absolute control. Then came the moment people still whisper about: the arrival of Diddy himself. His posture, normally upright and commanding, now looked guarded, eyes lowered, shoulders tense. To observers, it looked like the weight of everything: footage aired, speculation spread, legal pressure rising, had finally pressed through whatever armor he'd built over decades. Inside the courtroom, no cameras recorded what happened next. Media waited outside, unsure whether anything of consequence would occur. But behind those sealed doors, a silence settled so dense that even breaths felt loud. Defense attorneys whispered urgently. Prosecutors sat ready. Marshals positioned themselves along the walls. When the judge entered, no one spoke. The shuffle of robes and the scrape of a chair sounded like thunder. The judge didn't look at attorneys first, or at the defendant, but at the notes prepared from the long nights before, pages that now held the trajectory of a man's future. The judge's opening remarks were measured, emotionless, delivered like each syllable required perfect balance. The court acknowledged reviewing context surrounding the sentence, acknowledged the profound public response to material surfaced by Netflix, acknowledged concerns raised by legal scholars about the adequacy of the existing penalty in light of potential oversight. Defense counsel objected immediately, firmly, urgently, warning that sentencing reconsideration triggered by public exposure risked violating fundamental principles of judicial independence. Prosecutors countered, arguing that the purpose was not public appeasement, but judicial re-examination prompted by newly available context. The courtroom shifted, the tension thickened. For a moment, everyone seemed frozen, not because of uncertainty, but because a line was being crossed. This wasn't speculation anymore. A sentencing review was happening. Then came the turning point. The judge paused, folding hands over the bench, voice steady but heavier than any moment prior. The original 50-month sentence, the judge explained, had been determined based on information available at the time. But the judge now questioned whether that sentence reflected the seriousness of the circumstances when broader patterns illuminated unexpectedly by documentary footage, were taken into account. The court would evaluate whether the sentence required modification, including the possibility of life imprisonment if warranted by judicial discretion and alignment between sentencing guidelines and new contextual review. Diddy's attorney froze mid-note. The defendant's face drained of composure. Prosecutors maintained stillness, but their eyes sharpened. It was no longer whispers, rumors, or speculation. The judge had spoken words that changed the gravity of the case entirely. Words that signaled the unimaginable was now possible. Outside, the world carried on unaware. Inside, everyone present understood that the foundation of the case had shifted irrevocably. The door to a life sentence was no longer closed. It had been unlocked. And whether it would open further depended on what came next, in a process now set in motion and unstoppable.